It was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday afternoon. Just me, my buddy Derek, 2 lawn chairs, and a cooler of lemonade. We barely settled into my backyard when we heard the words that would change everything. A shrill voice screamed from behind the fence. "You've been warned about unauthorized gatherings." Then came 2 sharp cracks that split the air. Derek yelped and tumbled sideways into my inflatable pool. I dove behind my grill as smoke curled above the HOA fence line. Standing there was Margaret Holloway, HOA treasurer, wearing full camouflage gear and holding a plet rifle with pink rhinestones spelling out neighborhood watch on the stock. Turns out the HOA had called 911 to report what they called a dangerous assembly. That's right. 2 guys drinking lemonade constituted a threat to neighborhood security. But when the real police arrived, they didn't arrest us. They brought the SWAT team. My name's Michael Patterson, 42 years old, recently divorced, and I work as a civil rights attorney. I'd moved to Pine Grove Estates, hoping for some peace and quiet after years of dealing with corporate stress. The neighborhood seemed perfect with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns. I had a nice backyard where I'd installed a small vegetable garden and even built a decorative fountain myself. Margaret Holloway, however, had different ideas about what constituted acceptable neighborhood living. As the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA board, Margaret believed my property was destroying property values because I had installed solar panels without submitting the proper forms and triplicate-owned patio furniture that didn't match the approved color palette. And worst of all, I sometimes played classical music in my backyard after 9 p.m. Margaret didn't technically run the HOA. That honor belonged to Gerald Morrison, a retired insurance adjuster who had all the personality of wet cardboard. But Margaret controlled everything through her position as treasurer and her talent for sending threatening emails at all hours. She'd implemented something she called emergency compliance reviews, which basically meant she could issue fines for any reason she invented. The week before the shooting had been a masterclass in HOA harassment. My trash cans were cited for being placed at an improper angle. Derek, who was visiting for the weekend, received a violation notice for parking in my driveway without a guest permit. Someone distributed flyers around the neighborhood asking if residents felt safe with an unregistered garden operating so close to their children. Margaret would patrol the streets with her clipboard and a 2-way radio, calling herself Eagle Eye on the HOA security channel. She even showed up at my door with a 3-ring binder full of bylaws and said with a sneer, "We have documentation of your antisocial behaviors. Patterson, the board is watching." But it was Saturday's completely legal backyard hangout that pushed her over the edge. 2 adult men sitting in chairs, drinking lemonade from unapproved glassware, wearing shorts that violated the weekend dress code she tried to implement. In her mind, we were basically anarchists. So, she grabbed her plet rifle and decided to take matters into her own hands. When Margaret called 911, she told the dispatcher there were armed trespassers on private property, possibly intoxicated, making threats against HOA board members. The police in our area had been dealing with a string of false SWAT calls from various HOA disputes. So, they were already on high alert. But this situation escalated quickly when Derek managed to call his sister, Detective Rachel Morrison, who worked in the Internal Affairs Division. Derek was bleeding from where pellets had grazed his shoulder, though he insisted most of the red was from the fruit punch he'd spilled. I was still crouched behind my grill trying to process what had just happened. Margaret was pacing back and forth on her side of the fence, shouting about property values and the sanctity of neighborhood standards. What she didn't expect was the full tactical response. Within 15 minutes, Pine Grove Estates looked like a scene from an action movie. SWAT vehicles blocked every entrance. A helicopter circled overhead. Officers in full tactical gear were positioned throughout the neighborhood. They'd even set up a mobile command center right in front of Margaret's prized rose garden. Margaret was detained immediately despite her protests about having citizen arrest authority as an HOA board member. She screamed about her Second Amendment rights while claiming Derek had threatened her with what she called an assault spatula. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison obtained an emergency warrant to search the HOA clubhouse based on the shooting and false 911 report. What they found inside the clubhouse was beyond anything we could have imagined. There was a wall-sized map of the neighborhood with red X marks over 8 houses, including mine. Each marked house had a file documenting supposed violations going back years. They discovered financial records showing Margaret had been using HOA funds to purchase surveillance equipment, including drones, high-powered binoculars, and something listed as a perimeter defense system. The investigators also found a private message board where HOA board members discussed strategies for forcing out undesirable residents. There were detailed plans for something called Operation Compliance Storm. Gerald Morrison was arrested in the middle of teaching his Saturday morning yoga class at the clubhouse. The HOA secretary tried to flee, but was caught destroying documents in the community shredder. News crews arrived before the SWAT team had even finished securing the scene. The footage of Margaret in handcuffs screaming about the dangers of unauthorized lemonade consumption went viral within hours. Local stations ran the story with headlines like "Suburban Shooter Snaps Over Backyard Beverages" and "HOA Gone Wild in Pine Grove." The criminal charges were extensive. Margaret faced multiple felonies, including assault with a deadly weapon, making false reports to emergency services, misuse of HOA funds, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The other board members were charged with embezzlement, conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. The district attorney announced they were seeking the maximum penalties given the pattern of harassment and abuse of power. The civil lawsuit was equally devastating for them. As an attorney myself, I made sure we documented everything meticulously. Derek and I were awarded $65,000 in damages, full reimbursement of all HOA fees we'd ever paid, and a formal written apology that had to be published in the local newspaper. The judge also ordered the immediate dissolution of the Pine Grove Estates HOA. During the investigation, more disturbing details emerged about Margaret's reign of terror. Police discovered she'd been maintaining what she called a neighborhood threat assessment database on her personal computer. This wasn't just a list of violations. She had photographs of residents taken with telephoto lenses, detailed logs of their daily routines, and even recordings of private conversations captured by devices she'd hidden in the communal areas. One file labeled priority targets for removal contained strategies for driving out specific homeowners. My file was the thickest, documenting everything from the brand of coffee I drank to the license plates of every friend who'd ever visited. She'd even hired a private investigator to look into my divorce, hoping to find something she could use against me. The level of obsession was genuinely disturbing. The prosecutor presented evidence that Margaret had spent over $40,000 of HOA funds on her surveillance operation. She'd purchased military-grade night vision equipment, motion-activated cameras, and even a device that could intercept cell phone signals. All of this was hidden in a locked room in the clubhouse that she'd labeled emergency supplies. Gerald Morrison, the HOA president, tried to claim he knew nothing about Margaret's activities. But emails showed he'd not only known, but actively encouraged her behavior. In one message, he wrote that Margaret was doing the Lord's work in maintaining standards. Another email discussed plans to implement mandatory personality assessments for all potential homebuyers. The other board members were equally complicit. The secretary, Linda Brennan, had been forging signatures on HOA documents to push through illegal rule changes. The vice president, Robert Chin, had been taking kickbacks from the landscaping company in exchange for making their services mandatory. They'd turned the HOA into their personal kingdom with Margaret as their enforcer. During her testimony, Margaret insisted she was a patriot defending American values. She claimed that people like me with our solar panels and vegetable gardens were part of a larger conspiracy to destroy suburban life. When asked about shooting Derek, she said she'd been practicing her constitutional right to defend the neighborhood from what she called radical elements. The prosecutor's closing argument was devastating. He pointed out that Margaret had shot 2 men for the crime of sitting in chairs. She'd weaponized the HOA to harass law-abiding citizens. She'd stolen money meant for community improvements and used it to spy on her neighbors. This wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about power and control. But the real satisfaction came during the criminal trial. Margaret took the stand and tried to justify her actions by claiming she was protecting property values and maintaining standards. The prosecutor simply played the 911 call where she'd reported armed intruders when she knew it was 2 men drinking lemonade. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Margaret Holloway was sentenced to 3 years in state prison for assault with a deadly weapon and filing a false police report. Gerald Morrison received 18 months for conspiracy and misuse of funds. The other board members got probation and massive fines. The judge called their actions a grotesque abuse of power that could have resulted in tragedy. As the bailiff led Margaret away, she turned to the gallery and shouted that we'd all regret this when our property values plummeted without proper HOA oversight.